Right now, if you stepped outside without a jacket, your body would start losing heat within seconds. At 0 degrees Celsius, frostbite can set into exposed skin in under 30 minutes. Most humans today are dead within hours in true winter exposure, without shelter, without fire. But 24,000 years ago, on the open plains of what is now Ukraine, humans didn't just survive winters like this. They lived through them, every year, for generations, in temperatures that regularly dropped below -20 degrees Celsius, with no trees for miles, no caves, nothing but frozen grassland in every direction. This wasn't a rare act of endurance, it was daily life, and the evidence for how they did it is going to change how you think about what the human body and the human mind is actually built to handle. In 1965, near the village of Mezhyrich, in central Ukraine, a farmer digging a cellar hit something hard beneath the soil. It wasn't stone, it was bone. Mammoth bone, and a lot of it. Archaeologists excavated the site over the following years and found 4 separate structures, each built from the remains of dozens of mammoths. One dwelling alone used the bones of at least 149 individual mammoths. Skulls stacked to form the base, tusks arched overhead, like structural beams, long bones locking the frame together. Radiocarbon dating placed the site at roughly 15,000 years old, built during the tail end of the last glacial maximum, the coldest phase of the most recent ice age. There were no forests nearby. Wood, the obvious building material, simply didn't exist on this landscape. So the people at Mezhyrich used the largest available resource on the frozen steppe, the skeletons of the animals they hunted. But bone alone doesn't explain how anyone survived inside these structures. A skeleton, even a mammoth's, is not insulation. It's a frame, and that's where the story stops being about architecture and starts being about something stranger. The bones gave Mezhyrich's builders their frame, but a frame with gaps in it does nothing against wind chill at -20. So archaeologists looked closer, at the joints, the surfaces, the small details easy to miss on a first pass. What they found was deliberate engineering. Jawbones and pelvises were used to plug gaps between the larger skeletal pieces, fitted together almost like tiles. Hide, likely from mammoth, reindeer, or horse, was stretched over the bone frame as a skin, and evidence of red ochre pigment was found on some of the bones, suggesting the structures weren't just functional, they were marked, maybe claimed, maybe ritualized. Inside, excavators found hearths, not one but several, arranged in patterns that suggest continuous, managed fire, not occasional use. Charcoal analysis showed the fuel wasn't wood, it was bone and fat, burned instead of timber, because timber simply wasn't there. Bone burns at a lower, steadier temperature than wood once fat has soaked into it, which means these fires needed constant tending, not for warmth alone, for survival, hour by hour, through nights that could last 16 hours in a glacial winter. This is where the picture usually stops in most retellings. Humans build shelter, humans make fire, humans survive. But in 2011, a research team led by archaeologist Olga Sofer, who had spent decades studying the Mezhyrich material, uncovered something the bones alone couldn't explain: woven plant fiber impressions, pressed into fired clay fragments at nearby Upper Paleolithic sites in the same region and period. Cordage, netting, textile technology, dated to roughly 27,000 years ago, thousands of years before agriculture, before pottery as we usually define it, before almost anything historians once assumed early humans were capable of making. That's not the whole story, though, because a shelter, a fire, and woven cord still don't answer the hardest question, the one that separates a structure that keeps you alive for one night from a system that keeps an entire group alive for an entire decade. The frame kept the wind out. The fire kept the cold at bay. The cordage meant tools, nets, and bindings existed long before anyone assumed they could. But none of it explains how a group survived a single winter, let alone generations of them, on a landscape with almost nothing growing on it for 8 months at a time. The answer lies in what the excavators found scattered across the floor of the Mezhyrich dwellings. Thousands of bone fragments, cracked open in a very specific way, Not snapped by accident, not chewed by scavengers. Split lengthwise, deliberately, to expose the marrow inside. Marrow is fat, pure, calorie-dense fat, locked inside bone that most predators can't access. A wolf can strip meat from a carcass, but it cannot crack a mammoth femur open the way a human with a stone tool can. This single detail, access to marrow, meant that a group of humans could return to an already hunted, already scavenged carcass and still pull out enough calories to survive, weeks after the kill. Researchers studying the bone assemblages at Mezhyrich and comparable sites, including work published by archaeologist Pat Shipman in the 1980s, calculated that a single mammoth carcass, bones, marrow, hide, and all, could sustain a group of 20 to 25 people for well over a month, once every part was accounted for. Not just the meat, the fat under the skin, the marrow in the limbs, the organs eaten first before they spoiled. Nothing was wasted, because nothing could afford to be. This is where the story stops being about one clever adaptation and starts looking like a system. Shelter, fire, tools, and food, each one depending on the others to function. Remove any single piece, and the whole structure collapses within days. But there was still one more problem. A problem no amount of bone architecture or marrow extraction could solve alone. Food solved hunger, but food doesn't solve time. A mammoth carcass lasts a month, but an Ice Age winter on the Ukrainian steppe lasts 8. Between one kill and the next, there had to be a gap, and a gap, on a landscape this cold, this empty, should have been fatal. This is where the archaeology points somewhere unexpected, not at the bones, not at the fire, but at the space between the 4 dwellings at Mezhyrich themselves. The structures weren't scattered randomly across the site. They were positioned close together, facing inward, forming something closer to a small settlement than a single shelter. Multiple hearths, multiple families, most likely, living within shouting distance of each other, through the coldest months of the year. Anthropologists studying comparable Upper Paleolithic sites across the region have found the same pattern repeated: small clusters of related shelters, rarely just one in isolation. The reasoning is simple, and it isn't really about warmth, it's about risk. A single family, alone, is one bad hunt away from starvation. A cluster of 4 or 5 families can share a kill, split labor, cover for the sick, and absorb a failure that would otherwise be fatal to one household on its own. This is the part that rarely makes it into the story of Ice Age survival, the part that isn't a technology at all, not the bone architecture, not the fire, not the marrow. It's proximity, deliberate, structural, non-negotiable proximity to other humans, built into the very layout of where people chose to sleep. Every piece up to this point, the frame, the flame, the cordage, the marrow, kept one body alive for one night. It was the shape of the settlement itself, families positioned close enough to hear each other through a glacial winter, that kept an entire community alive across generations. You've never built a shelter from the skeleton of another animal. You've never split a bone for the fat inside it. But the instinct underneath all of it, that isolation is the actual danger and proximity to others is the real technology, is still sitting somewhere inside you, inherited from every winter your ancestors didn't spend alone.